December 17, 1944, near the village of Bulge, Belgium. The Ardennes. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, the kind that muffled sound and blurred distance. What had been a calm, grey morning erupted into chaos as the low rumble of engines rolled through the valley. To the men of the 2nd Infantry Division, dug in among the skeletal remains of a Belgian farmhouse, that sound could mean only one thing: Panzers. Corporal James "Jim" Hall, age 26, crouched behind the smoking barrel of his 57mm anti-tank gun. His face was streaked with soot and frost, his breath curling into the frigid air. The gun, nicknamed Betsy by the crew, had already seen too much action over the past 48 hours. Its paint was scorched, its wheels frozen into the mud, and now, its sighting scope hung cracked and useless, a casualty of a mortar blast the night before. "Scope's gone," muttered Private Lorne, the loader, brushing snow off his gloves. "Can't see a damn thing straight." Hall didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the treeline to the east, where distant black dots began to emerge, silhouettes of German armor. Panzer IVs, maybe a Tiger leading them. The columns were advancing fast, their engines growling like metal beasts through the storm. "Get ready," Hall said quietly, adjusting the traverse wheel by hand. "We'll do this the old-fashioned way." The men looked at him, confused. The gun was designed for precision: line the sight, adjust elevation, fire. Without optics, it was guesswork. But Hall had no time for hesitation. The enemy was less than a kilometer away and closing. He leaned down behind the breech, studying the terrain through naked eyes. A lone farmhouse chimney, a crooked tree stump, a stretch of frozen ditch, all became his improvised markers. He began to memorize their positions, sketching an invisible firing grid in his mind. "Loader, he ordered. Lorne rammed the shell into the breech and slapped it shut. Hall's gloved hand rested on the firing lanyard. He waited, watching the lead Panzer crest the ridge, its turret sweeping left, searching. For a moment, everything went still. Only the wind and the hum of enemy engines filled the air. Then Hall exhaled, steadied the gun by instinct, and pulled the cord. The cannon roared. The recoil threw snow and dirt into the air. A second later, a bloom of fire erupted beneath the lead tank's treads. The shell had struck low, perfectly placed. The Panzer ground to a halt, smoke spilling from its undercarriage. "Hit!" shouted Lorne, stunned. Hall didn't react. He was already adjusting again, a few degrees left, slightly higher. "Next one, AP round." The loader obeyed, fumbling with frozen fingers. The next shot rang out, and another German tank lurched sideways, its turret blown open like a tin can. The men of Hall's crew stared in disbelief. They had no scope. No spotter. Just one gunner, gauging angles by eye through a blizzard. But somehow, it was working. As the rest of the Panzer column scrambled into disarray, the field around them erupted in fire and confusion. German infantry dove for cover. Tank commanders shouted into radios, unsure where the shots were coming from. And behind the wrecked farmhouse, Corporal Hall kept firing, calm, mechanical, relentless. Each shot was a risk. Each adjustment was a gamble. But the rhythm of battle had taken over. The rhythm he'd learned after years of drilling on the 57mm, the feel of recoil, the time between the report and the hit. He wasn't aiming anymore. He was feeling. By the fifth shot, 2 Panzers were burning, a third crippled, and the others had halted, unsure if they'd driven into an ambush. The men around Hall could hardly believe it. The improvised aim, a mix of intuition, terrain memory, and sheer defiance, had turned a hopeless defense into a killing ground. Still, the fight was far from over. Through the falling snow, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank emerged, its massive cannon swinging toward their position. Hall wiped frost from his face, his eyes narrowing. "Tigers got us spotted," Lorne said, voice trembling. Hall nodded slowly. "Then we make this one count." He reached for the last armor-piercing round. The Tiger tank crept forward like a steel predator through the drifting snow, its 88mm gun scanning the ridgeline. Each track clanked over the frozen ground, grinding through the wreckage of the burning Panzers that had led the column. Flames licked the sky behind it, casting long, flickering shadows across the white landscape. Inside the battered farmhouse, Corporal Jim Hall ducked low behind the gun shield, every muscle in his body tensed. The air was sharp with cordite and smoke. His ears rang from the last barrage, but he could still hear that deep, throaty hum of the Tiger's Maybach engine approaching. "Loader, last AP round," Hall said, voice steady. Private Lorne hesitated. "Sir, that's our last one. If we miss, we won't." Hall's tone was quiet, almost calm, the same tone he'd used at the range back in England, when teaching rookies to fire under pressure. He reached out, feeling the cold metal of the gun barrel, aligning it not by sight, but by memory. Outside, snowflakes hissed as they hit the hot armor of burning tanks. The Tiger halted at roughly 600 yards, too close for comfort. Its turret rotated slowly, deliberate and patient, as if the German commander were savoring the hunt. Hall crouched low, peering through the shattered sight housing. The lens was cracked and clouded with soot. Useless. So he did what he had done all morning, he looked for landmarks. The crooked stump to the left. The ditch that curved toward the hedgerow. The Tiger's nose just past the fence line. He whispered the distances to himself like a prayer. "Elevation, 2 degrees up," he murmured. "Traverse, 1 mark right." Lorne stood ready, hand on the breech. Loaded. Hall's hands were numb, his fingers barely responding as he gripped the lanyard. The wind shifted, blowing smoke into his face. He could taste gunpowder on his tongue. The Tiger's main gun flared, a blinding orange flash. "Down!" Hall roared. The 88mm shell screamed overhead, slamming into the farmhouse roof. The explosion tore through the upper floor, raining splinters and debris. The shockwave knocked both men off their feet, plaster dust filling the air. Hall coughed, ears ringing, then dragged himself back to the gun. The Tiger was adjusting for a second shot, its barrel turning slightly, steadying again. They wouldn't survive another. Hall gritted his teeth, repositioned the barrel a few inches by instinct, and yanked the cord. The 57mm barked, smoke bursting from the muzzle. The shot screamed across the frozen field, a perfect line that vanished into the Tiger's lower glassy plate. A half-second later, fire erupted from beneath the tank. The Tiger jerked to a stop, its turret freezing mid-turn. A dull, metallic groan followed, then a violent flash from inside the hull. "She's hit!" Lorne shouted. "Direct hit." Hall watched through the haze as flames poured out of the Tiger's engine vents. A black figure, the commander, scrambled halfway out of the hatch before collapsing, swallowed by the fire. The rest of the Panzer column halted completely. The surviving German vehicles began reversing, their crews panicked and disoriented. Some tried to turn around, others fired blind into the smoke, unsure where the Allied gun was hidden. Hall slumped back, chest heaving. His gloves were stiff with ice and blood. "Reload," he said, though they both knew there was nothing left. Lorne just stared at the burning Tiger, the snow around it melting into muddy pools. You nailed it without a scope." Hall didn't answer. He was staring past the Tiger, watching the remaining German vehicles retreat through the storm. The valley was littered with wrecks, blackened armor, twisted metal, and the long scars of tank tracks frozen into the snow. The entire column, more than a dozen vehicles, stopped cold by one gun crew with a broken sight. And one gunner who refused to miss. Hall allowed himself a single breath of relief. Then, from far down the road, came a new sound, the distant roar of engines. Reinforcements. He knew they couldn't stay. Pack it up, he said quietly, already lifting the empty shell casing from the breech. We've done our job. The men moved quickly, gathering what they could. But as they prepared to retreat through the woods, Hall turned once more toward the ridge, where the burning Tiger lay silent, smoke curling into the pale sky. He felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. War had a way of making miracles feel like survival, nothing more. As the snow began to fall again, erasing the tracks and the blood, the battlefield grew quiet once more. But somewhere, in the frozen fields of the Ardennes, the story of one gunner's impossible aim was already being told, whispered through the ranks, spreading faster than the flames that marked his victory. By dusk, the valley was silent again, the kind of silence that only came after battle. The wind had died, and snowflakes drifted lazily over the wreckage. Charred hulls of Panzer IVs and the blackened skeleton of the Tiger tank lay scattered like relics of a storm that had passed. Corporal Jim Hall trudged through the snow, his breath fogging the air, his rifle slung loosely across his back. The 57mm gun, Betsy, sat abandoned behind him, half buried under fresh snow. Its barrel was scorched, its paint blistered, and its trail frozen solid into the earth. He paused once to glance back. That gun had saved their lives. But it also felt like it had taken something from him, a piece of his calm, his certainty, maybe even his humanity. "Come on, Jim," Lorne called quietly. "Trucks'll be here soon." They were heading toward a small forest road where Allied reinforcements were expected to regroup. Behind them, the low glow of the burning Tiger still painted the sky orange. As they reached the tree line, Hall looked down at his gloves. The fingertips were torn and blackened from cordite. He could still feel the rhythm of firing, the recoil, the seconds of waiting before the hit. It echoed in his bones like a heartbeat. Hours later, inside a makeshift field HQ, Hall sat on an ammo crate, wrapped in a blanket, sipping from a tin mug of coffee gone cold. His uniform was stiff with frost, his face streaked with grime. Around him, other soldiers murmured in disbelief as the story of his stand spread through the ranks. "You mean he hit 4 tanks?" one corporal whispered. "5, maybe 6, another replied. "And a Tiger, with no sighting scope." A captain from the artillery section stepped forward, a cigarette hanging from his lip. "Corporal Hall," he said, half grinning. "You're either the luckiest man in Belgium or the best damn gunner in the entire army." Hall didn't smile. He just stared at the cigarette smoke curling upward, lost in thought. "I just did what I had to," he said quietly. Anyone would've. But they all knew that wasn't true. Most men, facing a Panzer column with a crippled gun, would've pulled back. Hall hadn't. He'd turned broken optics and instinct into an art form, and bought precious time for an entire division to regroup. Outside, the sounds of approaching trucks rumbled through the night, reinforcements finally arriving. As headlights cut through the fog, medics and engineers stepped out, surveying the destruction in awe. A lieutenant whistled low. "Looks like hell out there." "You do all that with one gun?" Lorne, still wide-eyed, nodded. "Yeah, one gun, one madman, and no sight." The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned." By the next morning, word of Hall's defense had reached battalion command. Reports described it as a miraculous engagement, claiming a single 57mm crew had destroyed multiple armored targets and halted a German advance near Bulge. The intelligence summary called it improbable but verified. When Hall was summoned for debriefing, he stood in front of a table of officers, his helmet tucked under his arm. They asked him for details, how he'd calculated range, how he'd managed to strike so precisely without proper sighting equipment. Hall tried to explain. The terrain, the angles, the timing, the way the sound of the tank engines told him when to fire. But words failed him. It wasn't calculation. It was instinct. Survival. Finally, one colonel leaned back and said, "Son, whatever you did out there, it worked. That tiger would have torn through the entire company if you hadn't stopped it." Hall simply nodded. Then it was worth it. That night, as he lay on his cot in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, Hall thought of the men who hadn't made it back. The ones caught in the open when the first shells landed. The gun crews that never fired a second shot. He could still see their faces when he closed his eyes. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, the same one that had masked the sound of the tanks, that had hidden him from the enemy just long enough to fight back. For all the talk of improvised aim, Hall knew it was something more than luck. It was years of training condensed into minutes of desperation. He'd aimed not with his eyes, but with everything else, his memory, his fear, his determination to keep his men alive. And in that moment, the impossible had happened. In the months that followed, Hall's story spread across the Allied front lines, from the Ardennes to Aachen and beyond. Soldiers told it around campfires and in muddy foxholes, each adding their own flourish. The guy who took out a tiger with a busted gun. The corporal who could feel the range. The man who turned instinct into artillery. Most never knew his name. But they all knew the story. A single gunner. A broken sight. And a Panzer column turned to ruins in minutes. Years later, after the war, Jim Hall returned home to Ohio. He rarely spoke of the battle. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "Just doing my job." But every winter, when the first snow fell, he'd find himself looking out across the white fields, remembering that morning in Belgium, the sound of engines, the feel of the firing cord, the moment when the impossible became real. And though history might have forgotten the exact coordinates, the legend of that gun and its crew lived on, a quiet testament to the courage, precision, and sheer will of those who refused to surrender. Because sometimes, victory doesn't come from perfect conditions. It comes from the man who fights on, even when everything's broken.